What evil lurks in the dark? A question we have all asked ourselves many times. Together, we can start uncovering the truth and mystery behind the darker side of the otherworldly. And now your host of See You in the Dark, Michelle Roos.
Good evening to everyone, and thank you for tuning in again for another episode of See You in the Dark. I have a special guest tonight, and I can say I am, so humble and grateful that I can actually call her a friend. I don't even know how to start with her bio. It is the most impressive thing I've seen in a very long time. I don't think there's something she hasn't done. She owns her own business. She writes books. She worked with the FBI. She was spent her time interning with NCIS for cold case homicide units. But when I met her as a person who was giving a voice to spirit. And this is something we have spoke about a lot, how people think everything should be for the living. But we also talk about spirits in different ways, whether we go to locations, different places like that. But this guest of mine takes her abilities and all her investigative type of background and gives those voices to those who have lost it, especially during the Civil War times. And then she puts it on paper and writes books. I mean, I don't even know how to say, I'm in such awe of her, and I think all of you will. And so I don't wanna hold up and waste all the time because I know there'll probably be lots of questions. So if you guys could all just, take a moment and help me greet my friend and our special guest, Miss Courtney. Hi.
Hi, that was so sweet of you. You're the nicest person ever. But thank you so much for that intro.
Well, yeah, well, I was looking at your bio, and I kept looking at your bio, and I'm like, I don't even the words would not even, give you what you need. I mean, you think about it, when we met the first time in Gettysburg, face to face, and I listened to you speak, and seeing your abilities, the way they worked when, we went out there, in Gettysburg, walking around and the voices you were giving to those soldiers who have, perished for, for many, many, many years, and no one ever talks about it. They have a lot of visitors, they have everything, but then you took that and you actually put them in books.
Yeah.
And that is the most amazing thing I think anybody could ever do. So when we talk about we speak for spirit, you are definitely that person.
That's my goal. And after, working in the paranormal for years, it really sort of became like the mission of my heart is to give voices to people, share their stories, ensure they're not forgotten. And I think that's what all of us as human beings, fear most about death. And especially the Civil War soldiers would write about this too, was not that they feared dying, but they feared being forgotten. And I think by sharing their stories, we ensure that doesn't happen, that they're still a part of our world, whether they are walking among us in spirit or we are honoring their stories in our hearts.
And I think people forget, whether we look back in history, it wasn't always, unicorn, sunshine. There were darker side of that, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah. It
and
was
and it
rarely unicorns and sunshine, but that makes us, stronger people, resilient
yes.
people. Yeah.
And I think, a lot of people can, I had that question today, I'm learning about history, because she's wanting to become an American citizen. She goes, but American history is so dark. There's so many bad things. And I had to, stop for a minute and say, but you know what? Those bad things And the voices that were speaking out is what made us all change so it doesn't happen again.
Yeah, we speak from a point of privilege today. Every single one of us does. A privilege that is hard for us to comprehend because when we look at generations not even that long ago, their focus was on survival. In this world, making sure they had food, making sure they could survive the climate, making sure they had shelter, making sure those things were protected. And those are things that a lot of us sort of take for granted, and we can be more focused on our emotional needs. And that's something that they maybe could barely consider. So, those hardships earned us that privilege.
And people seem to forget that at times, they want to erase it. And, so it really warms my heart to know that somebody like you is still out there to still put that history, good, bad, or indifferent, but also making sure it's not getting erased. Their voices are not just getting shoved into a corner.
Right.
Um, so to start with the questions a little bit, when did you really know that this was your journey? This was what you were doing with your abilities, and how did that become?
It was really a reluctant acceptance for a bit, which is why you see sort of the government work in my resume. But yet it was always present in my life. So when I was growing up, I grew up or in a house that had a lot of, supernatural sort of happenings in it, some bad, some good. When I was 15 years old, my mom, Irish Catholic, raised us Irish Catholic, called Ed and Lorraine Warren to come check out the house. Now, I grew up in Connecticut. These folks also resided in Connecticut. So it was a sensical thing to do at the time if you lived in a haunted house. And Lorraine came to the house because Ed was ill at that time and really sort of took the reins and investigated, cleansed our home, and sort of told my mom and such that there was a gift in our family to see spirits, and that was something that we would always sort of encounter. So I was made aware of it at that age, but I didn't want anything to do with it. And I pretended that none of this happened. And I finished high school in my small town and went to college and didn't tell anybody I grew up in a haunted house where famed ghost hunters came or anything like that. And that's when I started, my internships with NCIS and putting puzzle pieces together. And when I was doing that and I was sort of intuiting information, I realized that was always going to be a little bit of a part of me. And then as I continued my work in the government, and it became so clear to me that I just was not meant to be commuting to this building and sitting in an office, I met this woman in Vermont who wrote about haunted history, something I had always been interested in, had given tours. I picked her brain a bit, had lunch with her, and I thought, you know what? I can do this. This is what's meant for me. So it took a while for me to do that. And I started the tour company and the books then in 2013, which was, almost 15 years after the Warrens came to my house. And then, so I did all of that. And then I didn't even start really utilizing the mediumship connection to assist me until a couple years later.
And so, you're talking about, of course, a lot of people, if you don't know the Warrens, I guess a lot of people are starting to get to know them with the movie The Conjuring,
Yes.
but they were actually the ones that kind of put paranormal on the map.
Yeah, they're
Because,
pioneers in the field,
yes.
regardless of, what you feel about them personally. They were the pioneers of ghost hunting in general.
Oh, yeah. And a lot of people learned a lot from them, and to say they were at your home, which is, kind of like, I'm a little jealous.
I
But
didn't appreciate it at the time. I was such a moody teenager that it was it was an inconvenience to me.
yeah.
Yeah. So when people kind of asked me if I was, marveled in my memories, I just remember being really angsty. So it's okay.
But I mean, just to be able to, think about it, like, God, I wish I could go back in that time and actually pay attention what I do now,
I
just to
know.
see how Lorraine, came about with all of it. Now, when you were writing your books and stuff, when did you really hone in on your mediumship to say, okay, maybe I need to see what I'm getting, then research it, or were you researching and then going through the mediumship to see if it coincided?
So when I was writing my initial books, I would kind of dabble in it a little bit with my ghost hunting and what I intuited. But really, it was the Civil War books that really made me tap into it. And that was in 2020, actually. That made me really just like go for it more strongly than I had before. And it was because at that time, I was running my tour company. The world was shut down for a few months. And so for what my company does, I felt I needed to stay relevant. So I was traveling around filming little segments of history and mystery in local cemeteries or places of note. And I had one scheduled, I would schedule out what I was going to record about at a grave of a woman from the Revolutionary War. She's fantastic. But when I went to bed the night before, I had this dream, and kind of a personal thing about me is I don't really remember my dreams. I'm not that person. So the fact that I did, was very meaningful. And in this dream, there were these two soldiers, very young boys in Civil War uniforms, looking at me. They told me they were brothers and that I had to know their story. And they just told me they were nearby. And so, the next day, I was like, obviously, this is a message and something I have to pursue, these boys. And I went to the cemeteries near to where I lived, and I found a monument to these two brothers who died at, in their early, like 2021 in the Civil War after having been prisoners in the war. And I knew immediately that I was to write about them. And that was William and George Brooks. And I did eventually find where they passed in Georgia, North Carolina, and went there. But I knew they were telling me that I had to tell these stories to make sure that these boys and soldiers weren't forgotten. So it was really then when they came to me in that dream that I decided that I would embrace it. So there were millions of soldiers in the Civil War, and I write about as many as I can. But the ones I write about, people ask how I pick them. And I tell folks that I don't pick them, they pick me. So they find a way of letting me know whether I'm, out and about researching and an animal goes by their grave and stands there and looks at me, whether there's a voice or an EVP that comes through, whether it's something in my own intuition, they pick that their story needs to be shared. And that's kind of how I went about writing those books.
And that's so amazing because if you guys, haven't read any of her books, we'll make sure you get links to look at them because she is actually bringing them back to life. It's not just stuff that she's finding on the historical society or different things. She really goes in deep.
I
And
try to, they aren't numbers. And I think that's, what I want people to know is we talk about the numbers in the Civil War and what side and what caused it and who was president, and all that's fine and good and great. Learn that in a history class. But these people they were brothers, they were sons, they were husbands, they were lovers, they were human beings, they were friends, and they had these things to them. And so when I find out anything personal, whether it's a letter they wrote to someone home or I'm traveling one of their old homes, like I found out a general I really loved lifting weights, and they kept the weights in his house, and he loved sitting in Cold Springs because he was like a health nut. And these little personal things, like some of them might have really loved music a lot. Or I found out another general I liked, people wrote he had to have mustard on his sandwich, and all these little things that just make them human like us, make them that much more fascinating.
And we, especially in the paranormal field, everybody always preaches of showing respect to the spirits, and they were human one time. And you kind of just take that just that one step further because, like you said, a little bit of mustard on a sandwich, you don't see that in a history book. And,
No, but I bring
so
him mustard to his grave still. Like, I'm like, you like mustard? I'll bring you mustard.
yeah. And that is really, what everybody keeps trying to put out there. If we're speaking for spirit, we have to find that little human side of them,
Hmm.
because it could be something like you said, there was a favorite song, or, did they like the opera or the, theater of some sort.
Yeah.
And that kind of brings them back to it's not just a picture, a rank, and what they did, but here's what they did outside the uniform. And that
Yes.
is so amazing. I had the privilege to listen to you speak in Gettysburg, and I was in awe because when you spoke, you could just see them all around you, like,
Hmm.
cheering you on, like, thank you, we're still here. Yes, we can all have headstones, but that's not where we're at. We're
No.
still
Yeah.
amongst everybody, So I talk about it a lot on the show that on my own journey, it was always, where do I fit in? Why do I see the things I see? Why is it always the bad stuff? And
Right.
it took me a long time to kind of, hone in and say, wait a minute, I am seeing this because that's what real life was. And they're
Yeah.
wanting that part of it, because we always hear the handy dandy, oh yes, the kids loved running through the halls, or the lady across the street always baked the cookies. But then
Right.
that's where it stops. And I think, in the paranormal field itself, we just don't give justice to those that have passed. We're just after trying to capture that EVP. And then we try
Right.
to say it's that person without even knowing anything else.
Right. And I think it's, I investigate too. And I, believe me, I love an EVP as much as another person, but I want it to be of significance. I want it to be something that they want to speak to me about, not just a voice, in the distance, because a voice in the distance could be someone saying they're there. It could be someone in another reality. It could be someone walking down the road. I want something that matters to the people I'm talking to, and I remember one of the first times I had what I think it was for me one of the most exciting EVPs I ever had, and I think you've heard it, Michelle. And it was at the Antietam battlefield, and there was a general who had passed away there. And there was a lot in the history books of questions about where he was shot from. And there were some comments on how he was kind of predicting that they were going about things the wrong way. And so I wanted to kind of hear from him what he was trying to do and where he thought the enemy was, what he like, maybe give him that voice he felt he didn't have then. And I asked him, from where were you shot? From where were they? And this EVP comes through and says, from your left, and I was standing where this man had been shot, so I could have a good idea. And the voice says, from your left. And I thought that's wonderfully significant. I got even more excited when I went to that man's home and I went through the letters that were sent home to his wife after his passing, which was tradition to do. And some of the soldiers said his last words before he died were, from your left. He was still trying to warn them. So those types of EVPs are so significant to the context of that person and that death that they're meaningful. But that's the kind I'm looking for.
Yeah. And, even when we do events, we try to get people to ask those questions that would be relevant to that spirit.
Yes.
We can't talk about Burger King because they
Right.
wouldn't know what that is, you
Right,
know?
right. And it's funny, people's instincts are so fascinating because I host investigations too. And the first time I didn't really give any rules, and I was like, why are they asking them about the Super Bowl and like, all this
Yes.
stuff?
Yes.
And so now I tell people, if we're operating under the theory, which of course it's all a theory, but if we're operating under the theory that spirits are people who who walked this earth before in a different time, then they are not going to be prophesying the future for us. They're going to be here to answer questions about their time on earth. So let's think about things that are relevant to them, that they would be able to answer accurately. But it's funny that, that's not a natural instinct for folks.
No, not at all. And when you try to tell them that's kind of where you want to go, and then you start, and they still go back to, like you said, Super Bowl, Burger King. And I'm like, okay.
I think there's this like inherent, it's part of the privilege I was saying we were given to be like more focused on ourselves and
Yeah.
emotional, but it comes off a little bit as selfish sometimes. Like, I'm like, I say to folks, how many opportunities do you have to speak to someone from this time? Like, surely you want to know something. I know I do. I want to know everything. So, I hope that energy is contagious,
Yeah, I mean, we were at a location, and it was kind of a great EVP, but we had asked, what was your favorite dessert? And a woman came across and said pie. And then we talked about like food, thinking, back then she would have cooked or whatever. Well, to find out she was the worst cook, she didn't know how. That, she passed away in 1978. So, of course, a grilled cheese made sense.
Yeah.
But she forgot to take the paper off the cheese and made grilled cheese, for the Colonel,
Oh, that's
with the
funny.
plastic still on. And now he loved her so much that, he took a bite, and when she turned around, he spit it out. But since she didn't know how to bake or anything, her favorite dessert was pies. She just didn't know how to cook.
That's really
And
cute.
so, you're hearing this because you automatically assume back then they all knew how to cook or do something. Well,
No.
nowadays people don't know how to cook either. So I'm pretty sure it's been back in the day the same kind of thing.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, I think it's it's so funny. My favorite stories about soldiers are always, when they would give each other nicknames. Like, there's this Georgia regiment I wrote about where the Virginia guys called them goober grabbers because they were always looking for peanuts everywhere they went. And they would, talk about them always like digging around for peanuts, and the funny things they would say to each other, or like when they would be in an area that wasn't far from home and the boys would be like, oh, I don't want to die here. The women here aren't as pretty as at home, just like the cheeky things they would say, but like that made them all the more real,
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah.
And
And I love
now,
it.
yeah. So, we always talk about balance, good, bad, dark, light. As you've been on this journey, doing the books and different things, even with your tour company and stuff, um, do you also, because there was a dark side on all of it, even during
Hmm.
the Civil War, there's a dark side,
Hmm.
you know, do you ever embrace that piece too and make sure that's also part of their story of, yes, they were humans, but here was a darker side, like, did they drink too much? Were they abusive, different things?
Yeah. So I do, and I don't. So, as I think it's important to acknowledge but not dwell, on their vices, because we're all human and we all have them. And I think it's important to share it so that none of us have this idea that we're supposed to be the model of perfection. But I also think it's important to state that this was something they did, not who they were, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's, important too. And especially with the Civil War, I have to walk that fine line quite a lot between the light and dark, especially when I write about Confederates. And I say that with love in my heart because my ancestors were all Confederate. So I'm not saying that with judgment, but when you write about someone who was a slave owner or who was fighting, to keep slavery or things like that, there is, you have to talk about that. Um, you can talk about it within the context of the time they live in, without demonizing the individual. But it's a fine line to walk. And I try to do that with all due respect to all sides as well when I do have to broach that topic. Like, there's a general of that was he was a favorite of mine, and he was one who found me. I was like in this back room of a library going through all these old documents that had never been digitized, and he had written at the end of the war that he had gone through a near-death experience, and he was actually giving talks about it. And he had been shot, I think upwards of 9 times in Antietam, and he had bled through his cap, and his wife had saved his life, and he went on to interview other soldiers who predicted their own death before it happened. Like, he was a fascinating figure when it comes to the Civil War overlapping with the supernatural. And I loved him for that. And I loved his personality and his wife. Come to find out, there were rumors, not necessarily true, but not necessarily untrue, that he was a founding member of a 3-letter organization, in Georgia after the war. And I, at first it was denied. I'm like, I don't want it to be true. I love him. And I was like, please don't let it be true. But then, you know what? I thought, I'm writing about him within the context of what the war was and his near-death experience. So I wrote that there were rumors to this effect that we don't know if they were founded, but at least acknowledging that out there is important. Just putting it out there as a fact, let people feel how they feel, but you're still putting that information out there, good or bad.
Yeah, and I think you have to do that because, like you said, we're not all perfect. Whether some of the decisions that were made back then, everything was about survival. And also, what kind of, rank did you have, whether it was military, outside, because that's what people looked at back then. It wasn't, were you a nice person? It's where were you, on the top of the totem pole or the bottom.
Right.
And people forget that, so the things that were done back then, I did an area where this guy proclaimed himself to be a doctor, but he never was,
Oh,
so it was kind of like, but he was practicing all this stuff because he wanted to make himself look better to society than what he really was. And, people lost their lives because of it, but they wanted to kind of hide that. And it
right.
wasn't something to hide. People do it nowadays, doing different things. But at the same time, you know, he what he said is what happened, and then also because he had the money to back it up, people automatically assumed that's what it was.
Oh,
In
yeah.
fact, and whether it was right, wrong, or indifferent, it's part of what his life was.
Yeah,
Eh,
money can mask a lot, and there's things too. I mean, I love that gossip about back then still kind of like comes out, like there were 2 big Confederate generals that like they both were considered Robert E. Lee's like right hand guys, Stonewall Jackson and James Longstreet. And I have had the privilege of speaking at the James Longstreet Society with the people who are, very much into James Longstreet. I have had the privilege of visiting the Stonewall Jackson house and talking with the people that, keep his legacy alive, and, visiting their graves and spending time with the spirits and places of both these gentlemen. And also I've gone to where they both died and where they were both shot, in a similar place. But their stories are so funny. Like, the people that support these gentlemen, even though they were on the same side during the war, argue about how much they meant to Robert E. Lee, or who got promoted first, or who fell asleep on the job at one time and didn't make a good call. And these are funny conversations, but they are very much conversations that I have with people about these folks. And I kind of love it because, again, it makes it more human to me. Oh, so and so didn't think this was a good move and he fell asleep under a tree and his men were pissed at him for a day. That's funny,
it's real.
Yeah, it's real. He was overtired, someone told me that one of them did that. So I asked the folks on that side. They said, yeah, he was exhausted. I said, I can understand that too. So it's just, really funny little things like that show the common humanity, no matter what generation we're in or what side of a war we're on. Those common threads of humanity are stronger.
Oh, definitely. And again, like I said, I'm always in awe. Now, I do know that, you also are going to be doing a trip. I believe it's next year. And that's
Ooh.
going to kind of take people abroad to talk about more of the ghosts and the mediumships and kind of bringing that whole thing alive. Can you tell
Yes,
everybody
yes,
a little bit
yes.
about it?
I am, and I just saw someone. Jerry says that Robert E. Lee might be his fourth great grandfather, and I think that is super cool. Stonewall Jackson's my distant cousin, and I have a portrait of him, and I just call it cousin. So I love that. But, I love that. But yes, next year I am going to be going to Ireland in September 2025, and it is going to be the Rebels of Ireland tour. And fittingly enough, you may have noticed that I have rebel ancestry, and I write about the rebellions here in America. But my first love of rebellions did come from Ireland. I lived there for a while during college, and I really fell in love with the story of the Easter Rising of 1916 and the Irish Civil War and their attempts to continually try and free themselves from their oppressors, who were the English and arguably still are, depending on who you ask. They're kind of like the Scottish with that. But their attempts to make Ireland a republic. And they have these beautiful sites and memorials and even battlefields and jails. And we're going to be visiting a lot of those that are pertinent to it. But we're also going to be putting into the trip these sacred sites that are spiritually meaningful, so that can help amplify our communication with them. And, the natural beauty of Ireland that we are all going to experience when we go there anyway. So very much similar to what I focus on here, we'll be focusing on with Irish history.
And I mean, so everybody, if you're into the history itself or the paranormal or anything of the metaphysical, I mean, this is actually a tour that's going to give you a little bit of all of it. And they
Yeah, it's a
can,
mix.
where can they find the information to go on the tour with you?
Sure. So, the best way is to go to Secret Ireland Tours and their website, and you'll be able to sign up there and book it. I do have links on my websites as well, my tour website, Seaside Shadows, and you guys can see my name if you're watching or anything. If not, CourtneyMcInvale.com. I have a link to it. And you can absolutely just click on that link, and it will pull up the itinerary, and you can see what we have coming up.
That is amazing. So now, guys, I'm kind of switching gears a little bit. We kind of went with the Civil War, giving the voices to them. But something that I got, and I think I remember you telling me about it, um, but you're also a descendant of accused witches?
Yes, my husband more than me, but I've got one, and I'm proud of her. Her name is Alice Lake, and so the witch trials in America are kind of fascinating, and we mostly think of Salem, which was in 1692, and it took place over a period of 4 months of 1692, June through September of that year. Due to mass hysteria and things of that nature taking place in this Puritan community. Prior to that, the early settlers from England and abroad that were coming and settling in New England, they also had a fear of witches. The Puritans really did. They were strictly religious. So Connecticut and Massachusetts and all these areas had witches that popped up that they believed to be witches. Mind you, none of these people were really practicing witches. This is all hysteria. But my 12 times great grandmother Alice Lake, she was living in Dorchester, Massachusetts, and her young toddler son passed away. And after he passed away, she continued to sort of speak to him, and she felt like his spirit was still with her. And she vocalized that to some other folks in her community. And they accused her of witchcraft for that. And she was actually hanged on the Boston Common in 1652. So 40 years before the Salem witch trials even took place.
Oh, wow. And I did a tour in Scotland and we were going on, of course, the tour of the witches and phantoms and things. And, listening to some of the stories that they did over in Scotland, if they thought you were a witch, I guess they were a little bit more, especially the women being petty. If they thought their husbands was looking at a female too much, they would just point at her and call her a witch. And that was it, and some of the things they did to them, like putting them there on top of a hill, putting them in a barrel, piercing it with swords, and then rolling it down to hit like a brick wall. And if you survived, then they knew you were a witch.
Right.
And so you're going to die anyways,
You're going to
so
die anyways. And Salem was similar. There was a gentleman named Cotton Mather, and he's kind of become the villain of Salem, with good reason. But he was a minister who wrote like the book on what a witch is, and he would come up with these things, these tests of witchcraft, and it would be impossible to survive them, but to die was to prove you weren't a witch. These people, again, the accusations, they were
yeah.
they're buck wild, right? Like, oh, she and her husband fought in public. But if the husband had money to not be charged with it, which is what happened to Bridget Bishop, he wasn't charged with it. And then she would be put in the stocks, and she was called a witch because she spoke back to her husband because she didn't have any money. And, so just different, like, of course, we've all maybe had a spat with our significant other where someone else overheard it, but did that cause our death? And it did for Bridget Bishop. And a lot of times it would be older people in the community who maybe people found them peculiar. Maybe they wanted their land inheritance. Maybe their land was next to it and they wanted use of it. And so they would find things wrong with these people and take advantage of the mass hysteria that was happening to make those accusations seem more real. And so it's interesting, the whole witchcraft thing, it really is sort of a rabbit hole you can go down, because when you look especially at what you're talking about and the witch trials in America, you're looking at people who weren't practicing witches, you're looking at Christians, and you're looking at, what mass hysteria and greed does. But these places have become sort of safe harbors for people who are practicing witches, who are practicing magic today. And I think that that's a really fascinating sort of sociological, study that could be done. Now these are safe havens, and now magic is sort of being practiced. And are people living in fear of it again? There's just so much. And where was the real magic if it wasn't these people? Do we believe it existed? There's just so many layers. But a lot of people think the witch trials, those were people practicing witchcraft, and that couldn't be further from the truth.
That's right. I mean, they were actually innocent people. And I think Cotton
Mm-hmm.
Mathers, if I'm correct from, reading up on some of that, he did like his drugs, like opium and things like that, or the
That was their
content of
medications,
yeah. So he was high all the time, and then he's writing a book of what a witch was, and it is just kind of, amazes me. It puts you down a rabbit hole because you're like,
It does. And Cotton Mather, what
yeah,
a weirdo, because I've been to his grave too, but he he had this ghost story in Salem that scared the bejesus out of him. And it was about a ship called the Noah's Dove and this couple called the Strangers, and the ship, gets struck by lightning and sinks into the sea in a terrible storm, and then it reappears and these strangers are waving on it, and then it vanishes. And this story terrified him. And that shows to me that he had such a belief in the supernatural that maybe a little part of him did believe it to be true. um it's hard to say, like, and I haven't gone to speak to Cotton Mather because I don't know, I don't like the man, but I'm curious if there was actually a fear that propelled him forward.
see, I would love to be on that with you. I think I'd go down that rabbit hole because, from what I've heard and read or whatever, not just the drugs, but he liked the ladies. He wasn't very Christian, I guess you would say. Um,
There was a Civil War general that also liked the ladies, and his name was General Hooker, and that's why there are hookers.
see, there's always see how much you learn from history. Can you imagine if we actually taught that kind of history to our kids, how much they would actually, keep and take it and, be like, I want to know more.
I
Uh,
know, it's so funny, but I mean, they were people too, and I just,
yeah.
we can't forget that, but a lot of it does match up. A lot of things we know today come from history.
Well, yeah, and some of the things we still do, and yeah, or we talk about or we try to change, it all comes from there. And the thing is, you can write so much in the books, but if you, just say, like I said, a rank and a number, I'm going to be bored. I
Oh
I want
yeah.
to I want to know the rumors and the gossips. What were you doing?
What doing, right?
And
And the rank and the number, if it's meaningful, right? So for me,
yeah,
it's like, if it was, there was one boy I wrote about, and he died in Gettysburg, and the letter promoting him arrived a day later, and that's sort of heartbreaking because that's something that would have like uplifted him. Um, among his men and uplifted his spirits, and that letter didn't arrive to him until after, but he had been promoted. Like, that's when I think rank stories are, so much more meaningful, when it has that, like, oh, it meant something to that person.
yeah. And just like I would love to go down, the witch trials and the different things to talk to them. I mean, because you think about it, I know a lot of women were called witches because they were midwives. And if a child actually died, they thought they killed them so they can make an offering with them instead of, just knowing it as a stillbirth. And so,
Sometimes, yeah. I mean, that I don't know as much in America. There were a lot of midwives. There were, a lot of people say, oh, because the women were making like things with their herb gardens, they would have gotten
yeah,
in trouble. And I tell folks that's actually not true. Not to be like the debunker of history, but like every woman had a garden of herbs in
yes,
her home. Every single one. This is how she healed her family. This was her apothecary. So that wasn't something that was being used against them, but it was more like, Bridget Bishop again. She visited a neighbor and held their newborn baby. A couple days later, the baby was colicky. And so when the charges started being brought up against Bridget Bishop, they were like, I'm going to bring up this colicky baby that maybe after she touched him, he was colicky. You know what I mean?
yeah,
Like maybe she did something. So they could like use what was typically something that never, raised an eye. Then they could turn it if like, the hype was being built about some other agenda. And quite honestly, it's scary because we haven't gotten much better about that.
no, not at all. The only crazy thing about it is now we have social media that actually throws it even out there further,
It propels
So,
it much more quickly, and the truth gets so hidden in every topic, and it's like,
yes,
and it's even like, I even joke with Marty, my husband, because like he doesn't he doesn't go on the phone or anything very much, and so he's very prone to like believing that an ad or something that looks like a news article is real. He'll be like, Court, did you see this? I'm like, it's not real. He's like, what the heck, why is nothing real anymore? But it's true. Like everything is just like, set to get a result or an action or get people to react. And the history books tell us what happens when that happens. Um,
and and you look at it, history is about to repeat itself one way or the other.
always,
We're
always.
always judging before we listen. Everybody wants to preach that you're innocent, until proven guilty, but it's really not that way. And that was kind of like back then, in everything. We're repeating it in a different sense.
Hmm.
And it's like, so then I get to thinking, what are our spirits going to be like? What are we going to be taught? We're going to be up there going, well, so somebody put fake news on Facebook and somehow I was pulled into it. And, what stories are we going to be able to actually even tell?
I
It's like,
know.
and was like, am I going to be an interesting spirit?
It's
What
going
am
to be
I?
interesting too because we're going to have more documented than ever before. So that's really fascinating. But I think I don't know. I think with history, I've noticed too that a lot more people have been reaching out to me about my Civil War stuff, not for history's sake or spirit's sake, but because they're like trying to pick my brain on if we're set up to have another one. So it's really, really scary that the world is in like such a fragile place. And I hope that's not the legacy we all leave.
Well, and that's what I'm saying because I would be a boring spirit. It'd be like, well, I don't know. I just sat and was watching scrolling on Facebook, seeing all this crazy stuff.
And
But
we'll be the spirits who are like, we spend our lives talking to spirits too. We're one of
right,
you.
we'll be like on Beetlejuice, where we sit there with the spirit psychologist there. Come here now. We can talk some more, right?
Yes, exactly. Like, oh, we were just like you talking to the dead. That's us.
And they'll probably ask us dumb questions too.
Oh,
Be
I'm
like,
sure they will. I'm sure they will. And I'll be like, I'm going to give you afterlife etiquette from the grave.
right? It's like I want to be that one where you just pop them upside the head and say, "Okay, listen. You want an EVP? Ask a right question." So,
I know, I know, I know. We'll educate them from the other side. Sometimes I think you've had John Zaffis on here before,
yeah,
so your listeners are probably familiar. But I had the distinct pleasure of being able to investigate with him because he lives not far from me, and we get to explore. And without fail, he is related to Ed and Lorraine Warren. Ed will come through and talk to him all the time in investigations. And I always think to myself, you know what? It makes sense. Ed would be the first person who on the other side would be like, how does this work? Like
yeah,
from this side, he'd be testing out like our equipment from the other side.
yep, absolutely. And we'll be like, "Okay, the cat balls are boring me. Can we try something new?" So,
Right?
and it looks like Secret Ireland Tours is on. Hi, May.
Hi,
Yes,
May.
she would definitely be that crazy mad spirit just like us. We'd probably be sitting up there spilling the tea, just having a good old time.
Oh, yeah.
Um,
Oh, yeah.
but again, um, if you could tell people a little bit about your tour, where about, your tour company of like if they came to visit and they did your tour, where you're at, what kind of things do you talk about, or anything like that?
Absolutely. So, we're kind of an expanding operation right now. So, we started off in Mystic, Connecticut, doing walking tours. And so, we still do those. Those are our most popular. Mystic is a sort of famous seafaring area up in New England, and it's a great little tourist destination. And yes, we have Mystic Pizza. Though, if you come on my tour, I'll direct you to better pizza. But you can, of course, get a picture with the sign. And so, Mystic, Connecticut, we have our downtown Mystic tour, and we have a Mystic graveyard tour in a colonial burial ground. We get to share the stories of Indigenous folks who lived in the area. We get to share stories of Revolutionary soldiers, Benedict Arnold, who's from the area, things like that. It's really great. And then we also do ghost hunting events in that cemetery and in surrounding areas as well. We just expanded just over the Pawcatuck River into Westerly, Rhode Island, which is down by a place known as Mesquamaket Beach. And there they also have stories of witches and pirates and all these shipwrecks on Block Island. And so we have our walking tour that explores those as well. And now we're adding sort of different tours that are not just walking, but also regional. One is going to be Supernatural Secrets of Southeast Connecticut. We're going to go to where Amelia Earhart was married, talk a little bit about her, where Humphrey Bogart and Lauren Bacall honeymooned, and where a famous suicide took place. And we're going to be able to do all of that in these new tours, and it's going to end with a cocktail hour. I'm so excited for it. And I am also working on 3 other ones: a witches tour, because we were just talking about that. That's going to go up to Salem and Boston. A vampire tour that's going to talk about the vampire scare of New England and go to those sites and graves. And also a Civil War tour where we're going to do battlefields around the East Coast. So to find out about all of those, you want to go to seasideshadows.com and you want to subscribe to our email list, because as we announce those specialty ones, I'll be emailing all the people on that list about it.
Oh my God, that sounds so amazing. I think I just need to take a vacation, just hang with you and just see what happens.
It's going to be so much fun.
I,
Yeah.
You had me at vampires and witches. I
Oh
mean,
my gosh.
right?
Yeah, the vampire scare up here. Oh, it was just a fascinating time. And I mean, it's been in recent history that people are still finding the heads of vampire graves and stuff in the local area. Just crazy stories. I know people who in their homes have vampire wards on their wall, just like really crazy stuff.
Oh, wow. Wow. And again, if you guys are just tuning in, Courtney, when I say she brings things back to life, whether it's on her tours or in her books, she is also a medium. So she gets some of that verbiage from the spirit, but she also takes that and then looks up the other parts of the history. So it's not just her speaking to the dead and then just writing it all down, which that would be very interesting to do.
It
But
would, but I love to corroborate it with what
yes,
has
I
been
do.
documented. And there's nothing that I think connects me more than to sit there holding their letters,
Yes.
or the newspapers that they, had contributed to, and talking about what they said. That's, the closest thing to heart, to make sure that what you're getting from them is accurate.
Yeah, but at the same time, it would be kind of nice just to say, okay, I'm going to pick three spirits. You're the strongest ones. Just tell me, just tell me all the gossip that happened, what year, who was the neighbor, what did she do, and what did this person not do? You
Yeah,
know, I think of like the Little House on the Prairie kind of thing, where you got Miss Olson constantly, giving up the gossip. I want to meet one of those spirits so I can just say, spirit gossip, spilling the tea. You know,
I
I
don't know
might
if
be,
my soldier boys would gossip with me, but they might. They might,
oh,
depending on their mood.
yeah, there's probably some stories, somebody might be wearing their uniform different, or they might have certain little things they keep in their pockets, what they would call good luck charms, like the lucky rabbit foot. Um, but it would be amazing to be able to do that. I mean, to like really give that voice and say, well, Miss Smith said that Mrs. Rogers, why her husband was gone to war, was actually, spending a lot more time with his brother. And, then little Johnny came along, but I just don't think, so.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. I have definitely uncovered in my work relationships
Oh, yeah.
that were not like, meant to be recorded. And that's always really fun to try to figure out how to dance around that.
Well, it's been going on for decades and decades and decades. So, I don't
Yes.
think it's ever going to change.
No.
Um, just real quick for everyone that's listening, stories like what Courtney talks about with her books and things like that. Um, you can see people like Courtney October 11th through the 13th in Springfield, Missouri. It's actually a unique type of experience where you have people with history, bringing those back to life. You have UFOs, you have cryptids. Well, I mean, we're talking about like the Mothman and all those, and
Oh my gosh,
how
I just went to go see the Mothman last week.
did you? I
Yep.
mean, it's a huge story, and it's like, you have so many people that talk about it, that have seen it, that still see it. You know, there's got to be truth.
Yeah, I went to the
Eh,
Point Pleasant, West Virginia one where they have like the statue in the museum. It's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, wow.
Highly recommend visiting. And they have a bakery that makes Mothman cookies, and they're excellent.
Oh my gosh. Yes. Yes. You had me at cookie.
I
Um,
know. They were cute, so I'd buy them just for that, but they actually did taste good too.
Oh, good. See, well, that's a win-win. Um, But, this is Into the Rabbit Hole, and it's XCon 2024, and it will be in Springfield, Missouri. They also have their links on the unxnetwork.com, where you can actually, get your tickets in advance because they do go pretty quickly. But there are so many great speakers. There will be so many vendors to be able to, it doesn't matter if you're more into Bigfoot than you are UFOs, there's something for everybody.
Yay.
And I am super excited about it. I am super excited that you were on here with me, Courtney.
Oh,
I
thank you for
can't
having me.
Absolutely. It was so light, but so real. And that's what we're
Yes.
needing is that real. Again, guys, you can go to secretirelandtours.com. That is where you can find Courtney's oh God, tour in
Yes, the Rebel of
September.
Ireland is on there. The other tours I mentioned are on seasideshadows.com. And
Yes.
if you are interested in book talks, I'll announce them on CourtneyMcInvale.com. I'm going to be doing a volume, that's my dog, a volume 2 tour for Civil War Ghosts of Georgia this October, all around Georgia. So if you're down in the Southeast, definitely come see us.
Oh, that is amazing. Well, I want to thank you again for being with us tonight. I definitely would love to have you come back on and
Oh, I would
get
love it.
let's do some, we can call it gossip time with
Yes,
spirits.
yes. I think that would be great.
Oh my God, yes. Again, thank you for everyone who's been listening and to support me. I'm sending you guys all lots of love and letting you know till next time, I will see you in the dark.